Hey everyone, it's Zach. I just wanted to make an intro to the ideology that I created called akronism. It's called akronism because I'm from Akron, Ohio, and I just was trying to think of names and things that related to me that I could use for names, and I'm from Akron, and akronism sounded good, and I think it's a good name because I love Akron. I think it's a great city, so yeah, akronism. So basically, I want to say we, but there is no we. It's just I at this point because I just made this ideology up. So, but I advocate for a voluntary democracy with no political parties. So let me break that down for a sec. So voluntary. So this government or this state would not force people to pay taxes, but people would give money to it. So, like, you wouldn't have to give money to the state, but you could if you wanted to. And that might sound like it wouldn't work, but the way I see it, like, the state could offer incentives for people to give money to it. So the state would have to offer incentives, and people would like these incentives and give money to the state to keep it running. So, all right, now the other thing is no political parties. So the thing is, I detest political parties. I am an independent, and I think that political parties, there's no way that any individual is like 100% Democrat or 100% Republican on all things. I'm sure that most of us are a mix of both, and we just vote for the party that's slightly more in line with us. So, yeah, that's the reason I don't like political parties, because, like, I feel like we're not truly being represented because, like, there's no way you're 100% a Democrat if you voted Democrat. I'm sure you have opinions that are sort of like out of the Democratic mold that you have, but you just like the Democrats more than the Republicans. So, yeah, I think we're not being represented properly because of political parties. So, yeah. So, a voluntary democracy with no political parties. So, voluntary and no political parties. So, yeah. And how do we achieve this? So, if you're an anarchist, I'm sure you've heard of an ideology called agorism or agorism. Now, I'm going to call it agorism because that just sounds better to me, but agorism is essentially activity on the market that is not, it's either a black market or a gray market. A black market is illegal, and the gray market is legal, but it's not condoned by the state. And both of these markets are peaceful as opposed to a red market, which is illegal and violent. So, like, agorism supports black and gray markets. Red markets are violent, and we don't support red markets, but we support black and gray markets, which are black markets are illegal markets, but they're peaceful. And gray markets are legal markets, but free from state control. So, yeah. And so agorism is that sort of activity with the goal of creating anarchism. Now, I created something that's a key part of akronism, and it's called state agorism. And state agorism is agorism with the goal of creating a new state. So, like I said, agorism is underground market activity with the goal of anarchy. State agorism, which I created, is underground market activity with the goal of creating a new state. So, more about state agorism. Now, agorists believe in the counter economy, which is essentially the black and gray markets. They call it the counter economy. Now, I created a concept called the counter state. So, now the counter state will be made up of many different counter governments. And the counter governments, anyone can form a counter government. And a counter government is just, say you trade on the counter economy. You could create a counter government with your fellow counter economists to facilitate the counter economy. So basically, I'm asking people who engage in the counter economy to create counter governments to go along with the counter economy. And counter governments, there can be many different counter governments based on either geography or ideology. And all the different counter governments together form the counter state. And my idea is for counter governments to not have political parties. I don't think counter governments should have political parties. So basically, if you're an akronist, you start essentially a government. We call it a counter government because it's not part of the official government. And this government would have no political parties. And your goal is for your counter government, along with all the other counter governments, to eventually become part of the main government. So eventually the counter state will overthrow the old state. So, so I call the idea of multiple different counter governments pluralist objectivism, because objectivism, Ayn Rand said that she supported a voluntary state, a state that didn't collect taxes forcefully, but people would just give to it, So I call myself a pluralist objectivist because I believe in many different voluntary governments. So the idea behind this is that you can pick a government that aligns with your ideology. If you're a communist, you can give money to a communist government. If you're a capitalist, you can give money to a capitalist government. And individuals are not forced to give money to governments they don't like. And so, essentially, in the same country, one could live under communism and one could live under capitalism, because that same country, while it would be one counter state, it would have multiple counter governments, and you could have a communist counter government, and you can have a capitalist counter government. Now, you could also base it on geography. And so, say you're a fan of local government, but you don't like federal government. You could give all your money to local government and none of your money to federal government. So, if you break it down for local, state, federal, you could give all your money to the local government or the state government or the federal government and none to the other governments that you don't like. So it's basically like you get to choose the geographical scope of your government. So, but the jury's still out over whether these governments will be more based on ideology and more based on geography. I think it will be both, a mixed bag. So, and we aim to create what I call the Society of Independence, a society where everyone is an independent and everyone, so everyone is an independent. And you might say, well, Zach, you just said, people want to live under communist governments or capitalist governments. These governments could be ideological, but inside of them, they will contain no political parties. And I think the idea of having different governments based on ideology would make up for the fact that we don't allow political parties. So, so sort of the governments would take on the role of political parties, and they would add an additional role to the roles they have already of a government, where they would take on the role of essentially a political party fighting for that ideology in the counter state. So we don't need political ideologies I mean, we don't need political parties because of the nature of counter governments, you know? So, and another thing, I think that the counter economy, an important part of this is I think the counter economy should globalize. You know, counter economists should make connections across country lines and stuff like that. And so this is globalization, but it's not the typical kind of globalization done by like free trade deals and stuff like that. I mean, you could have a free trade deal between counter governments, you know, but it's not like the normal state free trade deals, you know. And so this is, I didn't make this up, but this is called alter globalization, which is essentially an alternative form of globalization. So yeah. So anyway, this video has kind of gone on for a while, but yeah, we support the counter economy, but we also want to create counter governments. All the counter governments form the counter state, and counter governments should not have political parties. And this state would be entirely voluntary, and you wouldn't even have to pay any state if you didn't want to. You could live outside of the state. If you're an anarchist and you don't like states, you could live essentially without a state. You know, you would have that option. You wouldn't have to give to any government if you didn't want to, and thus you would not be bound by any government's laws, unless of course you violated the rights of someone else who is part of a government. Then their government would probably take action, but essentially you could live under anarchy if you wanted to. But so I get a lot of my inspiration from anarchy, but the reason I'm not an anarchist is because I think essentially anarchists, they say they don't want states, but they kind of do. So like, say you're an anarcho-communist and you want like a federation of communes. Well, to me, a federation of communes is a state. So you essentially still have a state. Like an anarcho-syndicalist, you have a federation of unions. That's essentially a state. If you're an anarcho-capitalist, you have a federation of... you don't have any federations if you're an anarcho-capitalist, but if you're an anarcho-capitalist, you want private courts and rights enforcement agencies. You know, those together, I think, would constitute a state. So we're essentially anarchists that admit that our system would have a state. You know, we're like, it's like, we're not anarchists, but like we're essentially not anarchists because of the language we use, you know, because we call what we want a state, you know. So yeah, anyway, that's Akronism. So I hope you become an Akronist. Give me some feedback on the ideology in the comments. I just made this ideology up. So yeah, be an Akronist, join the counter state, join the Society of Independence, and yeah, be an Akronist. I just made it up, so literally there's nowhere else you can find anything about this other than this video, and I have a small Discord server. But yeah, Akronism, I'm really hyped about it. And I just want to say, take it for what you will, take it lightly, because I just made up a political ideology because I was bored one day and I thought it would be fun. And I don't know if this carried through in real life would necessarily lead to a good or bad result, but I mean, I believe in it, you know. So just, yeah, and I'm trying to write a manifesto or something soon, so look out for that. But yeah, anyway, peace.